In the small, quiet town of Greenville, life was predictable. People went about their days with a sense of routine and familiarity. Neighbors greeted each other warmly on the street, children played in the parks after school, and crime was so rare that it felt like something that only happened in faraway cities. But all of that changed one fateful evening when an event unfolded that would leave the entire town, and eventually the nation, shaken to its core. Colonel James Anderson, a decorated Army officer, had just returned from visiting his elderly mother who lived on the outskirts of Greenville. It was a crisp autumn night, and the air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. James was a man respected by everyone who knew him. He had served 2 tours overseas, risking his life for his country, and had earned numerous medals for bravery. Back home he was known not only for his service but also for his kindness and humility. His wife Sarah often joked that he was too good to be true, but those who knew him understood she wasn't exaggerating. As James drove down the dimly lit road toward his house, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the simple joys of civilian life. After years of living under constant threat during his deployments, coming back to Greenville felt like stepping into a safe haven. Little did he know, however, that this peaceful drive would soon turn into a nightmare. It started with flashing blue lights appearing in his rearview mirror. At first, James didn't panic. Maybe he'd accidentally gone over the speed limit or forgotten to signal at a turn. Whatever it was, he pulled over immediately, making sure to stop his car safely on the shoulder of the road. As he rolled down his window, he saw Officer Mark Harris approaching. Harris was a tall man with a stern expression, wearing the standard uniform of the Greenville Police Department. To most people, he might have looked like any other cop doing his job, but those who worked closely with him knew better. Over the years, whispers about Harris's behavior had circulated among both colleagues and citizens. Some said he had a short temper. Others claimed he treated certain groups of people unfairly. But none of these rumors had ever been proven, so Harris continued patrolling the streets without much scrutiny. "License and registration," Harris demanded sharply as he leaned down to peer into James's car. His tone was cold and dismissive, lacking even the slightest hint of politeness. James, taken aback by the abruptness, quickly complied. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, trying to keep his voice steady despite feeling uneasy. Harris ignored the question and instead began scrutinizing James's face, then glanced suspiciously at the interior of the vehicle. Without warning, his demeanor shifted. "You fit the description of someone we've been looking for," he declared, his hand now resting dangerously close to the holster of his gun. James frowned, confused. "What description? I haven't done anything wrong." But Harris wasn't listening. Instead, he launched into accusations claiming that James matched the profile of suspects involved in recent burglaries in the area. These allegations were baseless, nothing more than stereotypes, fueled by Harris's own biases. James tried to reason with him, explaining patiently that he was simply driving home after visiting his mother. He even offered to call her if Harris needed confirmation. But none of it mattered. Harris seemed determined to make this encounter escalate further. The tension between them grew thicker with every passing second. James, though scared, remained composed, knowing that staying calm was crucial in situations like this. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, following every instruction Harris gave. But Harris wasn't satisfied. Something inside him snapped, perhaps triggered by his own prejudices or maybe because he felt challenged by James's calm demeanor. Whatever the reason, he suddenly reached for his weapon. Time seemed to slow down as James watched Harris draw his gun. Before he could react, a deafening shot rang out through the stillness of the night. Pain seared through James's body as the bullet struck him, causing him to slump forward in his seat. Blood began pooling around him, staining the fabric of his shirt. For a moment, everything went silent except for the sound of his labored breathing. Then, chaos erupted. Witnesses nearby heard the gunshot and rushed to the scene. Someone called 911, while others stood frozen in shock, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Paramedics arrived within minutes, working frantically to stabilize James before rushing him to the hospital. Miraculously, he survived, though the physical and emotional scars would stay with him forever. The bullet had lodged itself dangerously, close to his spine, leaving him partially paralyzed and ending his military career. Word of the shooting spread rapidly throughout Greenville. By morning, it was the talk of the town. How could such a thing happen here? In a place where everyone knew each other and violence was almost unheard of. Questions swirled as details emerged. Dashcam footage from Harris's patrol car painted a damning picture. It showed James complying fully with Harris's commands, keeping his hands visible and speaking respectfully. There was no justification for the use of lethal force. The community reacted with outrage. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for James Anderson," and chanting slogans against racism and police brutality. Social media platforms lit up with posts condemning Harris's actions, and national news outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach. For many, this incident was yet another example of systemic racism embedded within law enforcement. A reminder that no matter how far society thought it had come, deep-rooted prejudices still existed. Meanwhile, Officer Harris doubled down on his version of events. He claimed self-defense, insisting that James had reached for something inside his car. However, the dash cam footage contradicted his story entirely. It revealed that Harris's decision to shoot was impulsive and unjustified, driven by bias rather than genuine concern for his safety. This revelation only fueled public anger and calls for accountability. For Colonel James Anderson, lying in his hospital bed recovering from surgery, the world felt surreal. One moment, he had been enjoying the peace and security of his hometown. The next, he was fighting for his life because of someone else's hatred. Despite the pain coursing through his body, he vowed to fight back, not with violence, but with truth and resilience. He knew that his survival was not just a personal victory, but also an opportunity to shine a light on the injustices faced by countless others like him. And so, as Greenville grappled with the aftermath of the shooting, the stage was set for a battle that would test the town's values and challenge the nation's conscience. The story of James Anderson and Officer Harris was far from over. It was only beginning. The morning after the shooting, Greenville woke up to a town transformed. What had once been a sleepy, unassuming community was now buzzing with tension and outrage. News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts, local, radio broadcasts, and national headlines. People gathered in coffee shops, grocery stores, and schoolyards discussing what had happened. Everyone had an opinion and emotions ran high. For some, it was disbelief. How could such a thing happen in their peaceful town? For others, it was anger. Anger at the injustice, at the systemic racism that seemed to rear its ugly head once again. Colonel James Anderson's name became synonymous with resilience and courage. Friends, family, and even strangers rallied around him, offering support in any way they could. His wife, Sarah, stayed by his side day and night, holding his hand as he fought through the pain of recovery. She spoke to reporters outside the hospital, her voice trembling but resolute. "James is a hero," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He risked his life for this country, and now he's lying here because of someone's hatred. We deserve answers." Meanwhile, Officer Mark Harris found himself at the center of a storm. The police department placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation, but that did little to quell public fury. Protesters gathered outside the station daily, chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace," and demanding accountability. Some carried signs bearing James's picture, while others held banners condemning racism and police brutality. The protests grew larger each day, drawing attention from neighboring towns and cities. Soon, Greenville became a symbol of the broader fight against inequality. Back at the hospital, James began to recover physically, though the emotional wounds ran much deeper. He spent hours reflecting on what had happened, replaying the events of that night in his mind. Why had Harris targeted him? Was it because of the color of his skin? These questions haunted him, but they also fueled his determination to seek justice, not just for himself but for everyone who had faced similar injustices. As the days turned into weeks, details of the case emerged, painting a clearer picture. of what had transpired. Dashcam footage from Harris's patrol car became the focal point of the investigation. When it was released to the public, it sent shockwaves through the community. The video showed James calmly complying with Harris's orders, keeping his hands visible and speaking respectfully. There was no evidence of any threat or aggression on James's part. Yet, Harris had drawn his weapon and fired without hesitation. The footage left no room for doubt. The shooting was unjustified. The revelation sparked widespread condemnation of Harris and the Greenville Police Department. Critics argued that the incident was not an isolated event, but rather a symptom of a larger problem, a culture of bias and impunity within law enforcement. Calls for reform echoed across the nation, with activists urging lawmakers to implement stricter regulations and hold officers accountable for misconduct. In Greenville, the mayor issued a statement promising transparency and vowing to address the concerns raised by the community. However, many remained skeptical, questioning whether real change was possible. Amidst the chaos, Harris clung to his version of events. During interviews with internal investigators, he claimed that James had made a sudden movement, leading him to believe his life was in danger. He described feeling overwhelmed and pressured, insisting that he had acted out of instinct rather than malice, but few believed him. Witnesses came forward, recounting past incidents where Harris had displayed aggressive behavior or treated people of color unfairly. One former colleague described him as having a short fuse and being quick to escalate situations unnecessarily. Another recalled how Harris often made derogatory comments about minorities during casual conversations at the precinct. Despite mounting evidence against him, Harris refused to take responsibility for his actions. Instead, he doubled down on his narrative, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. Supporters of Harris, including some fellow officers, rallied behind him, arguing that policing was a difficult job and that split-second decisions, sometimes, led to tragic outcomes. They urged the public to consider the pressures officers faced and avoid jumping to conclusions. While their arguments resonated with certain segments of the population, they fell flat for many who saw the case as yet another example of systemic failure. For James, watching the debate unfold was both exhausting and infuriating. From his hospital bed, he gave interviews to journalists, sharing his story in the hope of raising awareness about racial profiling and police brutality. "I wasn't a suspect," he said in one interview, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was just a man driving home after visiting my mother. I followed every instruction Harris gave me and still he shot me. This isn't about one bad cop. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." His words struck a chord with millions of viewers, sparking discussions about privilege, power, and accountability. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like "Justice for James Anderson" and "Dashka End Racism Now," amplifying his message and drawing attention to similar cases across the country. Activists organized marches, vigils, and fundraisers, channeling the outrage into tangible action. Schools held assemblies to educate students about racial equality, and community leaders hosted forums to discuss ways to bridge divides and foster understanding. In Greenville, the protests continued unabated. Each demonstration brought new voices to the forefront. Young and old, black and white, rich and poor, all united in their demand for justice. Local businesses showed their support by displaying signs in their windows, while churches opened their doors to host prayer meetings and discussions. It was as if the entire town had come together, determined to heal and grow stronger in the face of adversity. But not everyone agreed. Some residents defended Harris, dismissing the accusations against him as exaggerated or politically motivated. They accused protesters of inciting division and undermining respect for law enforcement. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Conversations between neighbors turned heated, friendships were tested, and families found themselves divided. Even within the police department, opinions were split. Some officers acknowledged the need for reform, while others resisted change, fearing it would make their jobs more difficult. As the weeks dragged on, the legal process began to take shape. The district attorney announced that Harris would be charged with attempted murder and violation of civil rights. The news was met with cheers from supporters of James, who saw it as a step toward accountability. However, Harris's defense team wasted no time in preparing their case, filing motions to suppress evidence and casting doubt on the credibility of witnesses. The stage was set for a trial that would capture the nation's attention, a trial that would force Greenville to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. For James, the road ahead was uncertain. Though he was grateful to be alive, the physical injuries he sustained meant he would never return to active duty. The bullet had damaged nerves in his spine, leaving him partially paralyzed. Simple tasks like walking or standing for long periods became challenges he had to relearn. Physically, he was healing, but emotionally he was still processing the trauma of that night. Nightmares plagued his sleep and anxiety gripped him whenever he heard sirens or saw flashing lights. Yet, despite everything, he refused to let bitterness consume him. He knew that his story had the power to inspire change, and he was determined to use it for good. By the time the trial date was set, Greenville had become a microcosm of the larger societal struggles playing out across the nation. The case of James Anderson versus Mark Harris was no longer just about two men. It was about confronting systemic racism, challenging ingrained biases, and striving for a fairer, more equitable future. As the town braced itself for the courtroom, battle ahead, one thing was clear. Whatever the outcome, nothing would ever be the same again. The day of the trial arrived, and Greenville felt like it was holding its breath. For weeks, anticipation had built steadily, with everyone, from local residents to national media outlets, waiting to see how justice would be served. The courtroom was packed to capacity, filled with spectators eager to witness history unfold. Reporters jostled for seats in the press section, their cameras ready to capture every moment. Supporters of Colonel James Anderson sat on one side, wearing pins that read "Justice for James," while a smaller group of Officer Mark Harris's supporters occupied the other. The atmosphere was tense, charged with emotion, as if the entire town had gathered to bear witness to this pivotal event. Prosecutor Lisa Monroe stood at the forefront of the case against Harris. A seasoned lawyer known for her sharp mind and relentless pursuit of justice, she carried herself with quiet confidence as she approached the jury box. Her opening statement set the tone for what promised to be a dramatic trial. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but firm, "this is not just a case about one man shooting another. It is about accountability, fairness, and whether we are willing to confront the biases that continue to harm innocent people." She paused, letting her words sink in before turning to face the screen, where dashcam footage from Harris's patrol car was projected for all to see. The video played in silence, the only sounds being the faint hum of the projector and the occasional gasp from the audience. Everyone watched as James Anderson pulled over calmly, kept his hands visible, and followed Harris's instructions without hesitation. Then came the moment when Harris drew his weapon and fired, a single shot that reverberated through the courtroom like thunder. When the clip ended, Lisa turned back to the jury. "That was not self-defense," she declared. "That was an act of prejudice fueled by bias and a disregard for human life." Defense attorney Robert Klein countered with equal determination. A charismatic figure known for his ability to sway juries, Klein argued that Harris had been placed in an impossible situation. "Policing is not a job for the faint-hearted," he told the jury, pacing slowly in front of them. "Officers must make split-second decisions under immense pressure. Yes, mistakes can happen, but labeling every mistake as malicious intent does nothing to improve our system." He painted Harris as a dedicated officer who had simply misread the circumstances, a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of hate. Over the course of several days, both sides presented their cases. Witnesses were called to testify, each bringing new layers to the story. First up was James himself, who took the stand with the aid of crutches. Despite his injuries, he exuded strength and dignity as he recounted the events of that night. His testimony was powerful, not because of dramatic flair, but because of its simplicity and honesty. "I did everything I was told to do," he said, looking directly at the jury. "I showed my license, kept my hands where they could see them, and stayed calm. And yet I was shot. I'll never forget the look in Officer Harris's eyes. It wasn't fear or confusion, it was hatred. James's words struck a chord with many in the courtroom, including some jurors who nodded subtly in agreement. But Klein worked tirelessly to undermine his credibility, suggesting that James might have exaggerated certain details or failed to mention something critical. Under cross-examination, Klein pressed James repeatedly, asking questions like, "Are you sure you didn't reach for something inside your car?" And, "Isn't it possible you misunderstood Officer Harris's intentions?" Though visibly frustrated, James remained composed, answering each question patiently and truthfully. Next, witnesses testified about Harris's behavior in the past. Former colleagues described incidents where he had used excessive force or treated minorities unfairly. One particularly damning account came from a young woman named Maria Lopez, who had been stopped by Harris months earlier for a minor traffic violation. "He accused me of stealing my own car," she recalled, her voice trembling with anger. "He didn't believe me when I told him it belonged to me. He made me wait for hours while he ran checks. Even though I had all the proper documents, it was humiliating." Her testimony resonated deeply, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that Harris's actions were part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Klein fought back fiercely, attempting to discredit these accounts. He questioned the reliability of memory, pointing out inconsistencies in witness statements. He also brought in character witnesses to speak on Harris's behalf, portraying him as a hard-working family man who cared deeply about his community. Among them was Harris's wife, Emily, who tearfully described her husband as someone who always put others first. "Mark joined the police force because he wanted to protect people," she insisted. "He's not perfect, but he doesn't deserve to be vilified like this." As the trial progressed, expert witnesses weighed in on key aspects of the case. Forensic analysts confirmed that the bullet trajectory matched James's position behind the steering wheel, further disproving Harris's claim of self-defense. Psychologists discussed implicit bias and how it could influence decision-making, especially in high-stress situations like traffic stops. Each piece of evidence added weight to the prosecution's case, painting a picture of a man whose prejudices had led to catastrophic consequences. Throughout it all, Harris sat stoically beside his attorney, rarely showing any emotion. Occasionally, he glanced toward the gallery, meeting the eyes of his supporters or exchanging brief whispers with Klein, but for the most part, he remained silent, leaving the talking to his defense team. Outside the courtroom, however, tension simmered. Protesters continued to gather daily, their chants growing louder as the trial dragged on. Counter-protesters appeared too, carrying signs that read, "Support our police," and "Blue Lives Matter." The divide between the two groups widened, creating an uneasy atmosphere in the streets of Greenville. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Lisa Monroe delivered a passionate plea to the jury, urging them to consider the broader implications of their verdict. "This is not just about punishing one bad actor," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "It's about sending a message that racism has no place in law enforcement or anywhere else. We cannot move forward as a society until we hold individuals accountable for their actions." Robert Klein, meanwhile, appealed to the jury's sense of fairness. "Before you decide, ask yourselves this. Is it fair to ruin a man's life based on one mistake?" he asked. "Officer Harris made an error in judgment, yes, but does that make him guilty of attempted murder? Does that justify throwing away decades of service?" When the judge finally dismissed the jury to deliberate, the courtroom erupted into murmurs and whispers. Reporters rushed outside to file updates, while supporters lingered anxiously, hoping for news. Inside the deliberation room, jurors pored over the evidence, debating passionately about guilt, intent, and responsibility. Hours stretched into days as they wrestled with the enormity of their decision. Every detail, the dashcam footage, the testimonies, the expert analyses, was scrutinized meticulously. For Greenville, those days felt endless. Conversations revolved around one question: what would the verdict be? Would justice prevail, or would the system fail once again? As the nation waited alongside the town, the trial became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a referendum on trust, equality, and the possibility of change. Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain. The ripple effects of this case would be felt far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The verdict arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day that usually brought comfort to Greenville. But today, the air felt heavy with anticipation. People gathered outside the courthouse long before sunrise, their breath visible in the cool breeze as they waited anxiously for the jury's decision. Protest signs leaned against lampposts and reporters set up cameras and microphones, ready to broadcast the moment live to the nation. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Supporters of Colonel James Anderson sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching each other's hands tightly. On the opposite side, Officer Mark Harris's family members exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was to come. When the jury finally entered the room, everyone fell silent. The foreperson stood holding the slip of paper that contained the verdict. The judge instructed them to read it aloud, and for a brief second, time seemed to freeze. Then came the words that would change everything. "We find the defendant, Mark Harris, guilty on all counts, attempted murder in violation of civil rights." A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. For James's supporters, it was a moment of triumph, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced one another. Cheers erupted outside, where hundreds had gathered, chanting slogans like, "Justice served," and "No more hate." Some even broke into song, singing hymns of hope and resilience. It was a rare moment of unity in a town that had been divided for so long, but not everyone shared in the jubilation. Harris's wife, Emily, buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, while Harris himself stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. His defense attorney, Robert Klein, leaned over to whisper something to him, but Harris didn't respond. He simply sat there, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the verdict had crushed him entirely. The judge wasted no time in delivering the sentence. Addressing Harris directly, she said sternly, "Your badge does not give you the authority to act above the law. You used your position of power to harm an innocent man based on nothing more than prejudice. This court will not tolerate such behavior." With those words, she sentenced Harris to 30 years in prison without parole, a punishment that left some satisfied and others outraged. For many residents of Greenville, the verdict represented a turning point. It wasn't just about punishing Harris. It was about acknowledging the systemic issues that allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. Activists saw it as a victory for accountability and a step toward meaningful reform. "This is proof that we can make a difference," said Sarah Anderson, James's wife, during an emotional press conference after the trial. "If we stand together and demand justice, real change is possible." However, not everyone agreed. Critics argued that the sentence was too harsh, claiming it sent the wrong message to law enforcement officers who already faced immense pressure on the job. "What about the good cops?" asked one protester, holding a sign that read, "Support our police." "Are we supposed to believe they're all bad now because of one mistake?" Despite the backlash, the verdict sparked a national conversation. News outlets across the country covered the story extensively, framing it as a landmark case in the fight against racial profiling and police brutality. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "EGI accountability matters" and "darn systemic change now" as people shared their thoughts on how to address these deep-rooted problems. Schools held assemblies to discuss racism and equality, while community leaders organized workshops aimed at fostering understanding between law enforcement and citizens. In Greenville, efforts to rebuild trust began almost immediately. The mayor announced plans to implement sweeping reforms within the police department, including mandatory bias training, increased oversight, and stricter guidelines for the use of force. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, ensuring transparency in future encounters. Community forums were held regularly, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns and offer suggestions. Slowly but surely, the town started to heal, though scars remained. For Colonel James Anderson, The verdict brought a measure of closure but couldn't erase the trauma he had endured. Physically, he continued to recover, attending physical therapy sessions multiple times a week to regain strength in his legs. Emotionally, however, the road to healing was much harder. Nightmares still plagued him, replaying the events of that fateful night over and over again. Sometimes he found himself avoiding streets or places that reminded him of the shooting, unable to shake the feeling of vulnerability that lingered. Yet, despite everything, James refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his pain into purpose. He began speaking publicly about his experience, traveling to schools, churches, and conferences to share his story. His message was simple yet powerful. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. We need to talk openly about racism and injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. Only then can we create a world where everyone feels safe and valued. His advocacy work inspired countless others to join the movement for change. Young activists looked up to him as a role model, someone who had faced unimaginable hardship, but chose to rise above it. Veterans rallied behind him, seeing his fight as an extension of the values they had sworn to uphold: freedom, equality, and justice for all. Even those who initially doubted his story came around, moved by his courage and determination. As for Officer Mark Harris, his life took a drastically different turn. Stripped of his badge and uniform, he disappeared from public view, entering a state penitentiary far from Greenville. Life behind bars proved challenging for someone accustomed to wielding authority. Reports surfaced of him struggling to adjust, often clashing with fellow inmates and guards alike. Rumors circulated that he spent most of his time isolated, reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. Whether he ever truly understood the gravity of his actions or felt remorse remained unclear. Meanwhile, Greenville continued to evolve. The protests eventually subsided, replaced by quieter but equally impactful acts of solidarity. Neighbors reached out to one another, bridging gaps that had once seemed insurmountable. Local businesses partnered with community organizations to fund scholarships for underprivileged youth, while churches hosted interfaith dialogues to promote unity. It was as if the entire town had decided to turn its collective pain into progress. Still, challenges persisted. Not everyone agreed on how best to move forward, and disagreements occasionally flared up. But for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope, a belief that Greenville could emerge stronger and more united than before. The case of James Anderson versus Mark Harris had forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, but it had also shown that growth was possible, even in the face of adversity. By the time winter arrived, snow blanketing the streets of Greenville, the town felt different somehow. Quieter perhaps, but also more determined. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability had become part of everyday life, woven into the fabric of the community. And though the journey ahead was far from over, one thing was clear: the ripple effects of this case would continue to shape Greenville and the nation for years to come. Justice had been served, but the fight for true equality was only beginning. Months turned into years, and Greenville slowly began to rebuild itself. The scars of the trial lingered, but so did the lessons learned. For Colonel James Anderson, life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The shooting had ended, his military career prematurely, leaving him physically disabled and emotionally scarred. Yet it also gave him a new purpose, one that extended far beyond the confines of his hometown. He became a symbol of resilience, a voice for those who felt silenced by prejudice and injustice. James's advocacy work took center stage as he traveled across the country, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. From college auditoriums to community centers, he spoke passionately about the need for systemic change within law enforcement and society at large. His speeches were raw and unfiltered, drawing from his own experiences to highlight the deep-rooted issues of racial profiling and police brutality. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," he often said. "It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem we can no longer ignore." His message resonated deeply, inspiring countless individuals to take action in their own communities. Young activists looked up to him as a mentor, someone who embodied courage and perseverance. Veterans, too, rallied behind him, seeing his fight as an extension of the values they had sworn to uphold during their service: freedom, equality, and justice for all. Even skeptics who initially dismissed his story found themselves moved by his sincerity and determination. In Greenville, the changes brought about by the trial continued to unfold. The town implemented sweeping reforms within its police department, including mandatory bias training, increased oversight, and stricter guidelines for the use of force. Body cameras became standard equipment for every officer, ensuring transparency in future encounters. Community forums were held regularly, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns and offer suggestions. These efforts helped mend some of the broken trust between law enforcement and citizens, though the process was slow and occasionally fraught with setbacks. The protests that had once filled the streets of Greenville evolved into quieter acts of solidarity. Neighbors reached out to one another, bridging gaps that had once seemed insurmountable. Local businesses partnered with community organizations to fund scholarships for underprivileged youth, while churches hosted interfaith dialogues to promote unity. It was as if the entire town had decided to turn its collective pain into progress. For Sarah Anderson, James's wife, the journey was bittersweet. She stood by her husband through every step of his recovery, celebrating his victories and comforting him during moments of despair. Together, they worked tirelessly to raise awareness about racial inequality, using their platform to amplify marginalized voices. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to love and resilience in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Harris faded into obscurity, serving his sentence far from the spotlight. Life in prison proved challenging for someone accustomed to wielding authority. Reports surfaced of him struggling to adjust, often clashing with fellow inmates and guards alike. Some speculated that he spent most of his time reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point, though whether he ever truly understood the gravity of his actions or felt remorse remained unclear. Back in Greenville, the case of James Anderson versus Mark Harris became a cautionary tale, taught in schools and discussed in town hall meetings. It served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked prejudice and the importance of accountability. For many, it was also a source of hope, a proof that standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting, could lead to meaningful change. As time went on, James found solace in small victories. Walking without crutches became easier, thanks to months of physical therapy. Nightmares still visited him occasionally, but they grew less frequent, replaced by dreams of a brighter future. He began mentoring young people, particularly those from marginalized communities, encouraging them to pursue their goals despite the obstacles they might face. "You are stronger than you think," he told them, "and your voice matters more than you realize." Sarah, meanwhile, channeled her energy into supporting other families affected by similar tragedies. She co-founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing resources and counseling to victims of police violence. Through workshops and support groups, she helped survivors navigate the complex emotions that came with healing. Her work earned her widespread recognition, further amplifying the couple's impact. Greenville itself transformed over the years. What had once been a divided town emerged as a model for reconciliation and growth. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability became part of everyday life, woven into the fabric of the community. Schools introduced curricula focused on diversity and inclusion, while local leaders prioritized policies aimed at reducing inequality. The town even erected a memorial in honor of James Anderson, not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The anniversary of the verdict, hundreds gathered at the memorial to reflect on how far they had come, and how much farther they still had to go. James addressed the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've made progress," he said, "but our work is far from over. True equality requires constant effort, unwavering commitment, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Let us continue to stand together, united in our pursuit of justice." As the sun set over Greenville that evening, casting a golden glow over the town, there was a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but the people of Greenville were determined to walk it together. They had faced darkness and emerged stronger, proving that even in the bleakest moments light could prevail. For James Anderson, the journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. He had lost much, a piece of his health, a fragment of his peace, but in return he had gained something invaluable, the knowledge that his survival had sparked a movement fueled by courage, compassion, and an unyielding belief in the possibility of a better world. And as he stood alongside his wife, surrounded by friends and supporters, he knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice was far from over, but neither was his resolve to see it through.